Grand strategy is one of my favorite genres, and if it's yours too, you might have asked yourself before, why does Paradox Interactive dominate this genre? Most other genres have at least a couple of companies competing for them, if not a few more. But when it comes to grand strategy, it's almost as if there's only one company dominating the entire market. So why is that? And if I were to, let's say, make a game to compete with Paradox, what exactly do I think is the, let's say, golden key to dethroning them and actually having a substantial part of the market of actually reaching people who love grand strategy and having them play your game? This is a topic I care about a lot. This is one of my favorite genres after all, and I do think in analyzing what makes Paradox Interactive successful, we can try and start to replicate that sort of behavior. The first thing that I learned, because I have tried to tackle working on a grand strategy game, is how incredibly complicated it is. I have a full video covering my experience working on a grand strategy game, but the conclusion I reached was that doing it solo is near impossible. And when you look at the indie gaming scene, that's most of the people trying to make games. There's this almost cult fascination with being a solo developer. It's something attractive. It's a, let's say, marketing ploy by some, and for others it's just a way to avoid working with people, which can be a problem. So I think the first way of tackling this issue is having actually larger companies trying to break into this market. I think grand strategy as a genre is smaller than what AAAs would consider a viable market to break into, but at the same time it's, let's say, big enough for indies to want to get into, but indies themselves aren't big enough to tackle the genre. So there's this weird middle ground. And I do think that that's where Paradox shines, that's where it enters. You see, now Paradox is like a hundreds of employees company. It's massive, it's almost basically a AAA company. But that wasn't how it started off, especially say 10 years ago when they were working on something like Europa Universalis 4, which I think is the main game that actually popularized grand strategy. I'd argue it's the one that I played the most early on, although I did have experience playing Europa Universalis 3. I tried to get into Crusader Kings 2 and Victoria 2, but didn't enjoy them that much. Europa Universalis 4 was the first game that I played obsessively and I absolutely adored. And so the level of complexity mixed with the market and how it functions, I think deters the larger companies from getting into it, and at the same time is way too difficult for the smaller companies. So it creates this weird middle ground where you need to have a relatively reasonably sized company to compete in this, but at the same time you can't be too big because you probably won't profit enough to, let's say, make it worth your while. And I think Paradox is one of the few companies that fits very well within this Goldilocks zone, and that's what gave it an edge and allowed it to, let's say, build up the genre as well. Because I don't think the genre was as popular as it was were it not for Paradox. And there are other games, by the way. It's not that there aren't. It's not that no one is trying to make them. It's just that none of them reach that level of popularity, or, well, in my personal opinion, are good enough to try and eat up some of the market. I've tried a few of them, but none of them captured me the way that Paradox games do. And now, as opposed to, let's say, 10 years ago, this can partially be attributed to a sense of brand loyalty. Whenever you see that Paradox logo, you sort of have an expectation of what you're getting into. Sometimes they miss the mark. I'd argue that Victoria 3 was one of those games that, let's say, didn't resonate as much with people. But sometimes they nail it. I'd argue that the top 3 currently are Europa Universalis 4, Hearts of Iron 4, and Crusader Kings 3. I'm not counting Stellaris necessarily because it was a surprise hit, because it's not trying to sell itself as a purely grand strategy game. It's trying to go in a 4X grand strategy, let's say, adjacent approach. I do still consider it a grand strategy game personally, but I think some people also don't, which is why I'm just setting it as like a mixed, weird, in-between thing. So what else have they tried and failed in? I'd argue that Imperator Rome didn't hit as much, but I think that it's a great game, and I'm not quite sure why it didn't do that well. Some people recently tried to revive it and regain interest into it, but I think that it's partially because of the time period. And this is surprising. I thought that the Roman time period had this allure, especially from games like Rome Total War dominating within the scene. I do think that people want something different. It might not be that the Roman time era isn't something that people want, I just think that it's maybe saturated, because even the games that were made 10, 20 years ago are still viable. And I'm not saying that Imperator was perfect, it had a lot of issues, especially at launch, but as it went on, it improved a lot. And I think Imperator's main issue is that it's too complicated, and this is a bit weird for a grand strategy game. You'd assume that people love and adore the complexity, and that is true. But there is a difference between things being complicated and deep and things being complicated and shallow. And I think that Imperator had an issue where a lot of its mechanics were pretty shallow. They really didn't matter that much. It was just clicking a few buttons and just having a reward related to that button clicking. It was weird. And the UI and /UX was also kind of all over the place. There were screens in particular where I just didn't know what was clickable and what was, and the buttons were in just random places and they did very random stuff. And there was like 15 buttons that just gave you bonuses occasionally for some reason, so you just need to remember to keep clicking them, and that's it. There's no, let's say, strategy or thought process into them. So I think those are some of the issues that plagued Imperator in particular. And another game that I was surprised that it missed the mark this badly is Victoria 3. You see, Victoria, I think, is actually popular in this time period. It has some popularity behind it. And the main culprit that people refer to is the military system. Although, when I heard about the, let's say, hands-off approach military, I was actually excited, because I do not enjoy the micromanaging of armies in Europa Universalis. I think it's one of the worst aspects of Europa Universalis. But I'd argue that my favorite military combat system in any Paradox game is the Hearts of Iron approach. It's just, in my opinion, the best one. And it's fairly autonomous if you want it to be. And I think that's where the key strength of Hearts of Iron is. If you do not want to touch your units and just have your battle plans and let it go, you can, and then you could focus on other aspects of the game and enjoy those, and that's my particular personal, let's say, preference or approach. And that's why for Hearts of Iron in particular, 90% of my time is spent on mods, not on the game itself, but I'll get back to that point later. But Victoria, there is no way to micromanage. In Hearts of Iron, some people can do plays, and there's all this hype about, let's say, encircling your enemy and crushing them, and there's some depth there, there's some choice. You decide based on the terrain what units to place and when, and so on. But in Victoria, the, let's say, progression of your units is linear, which is just like Europa Universalis, which is fine. But at least in EU, you can do things like position your armies behind a mountain or attack a fort at a certain time. There's still some mechanical, let's say, decision making, and it's mostly based on locations and timing. And that's something very interesting. In Victoria, there is nothing to do whatsoever. You just tell your units to fight on a front. Not to mention that the front system in Victoria is horrendous, which I think is one of the major issues. Had it just been front lines in general, this is the army that commands them, I think it would have actually been better. So ironically, I think they just didn't commit to the hands-off approach enough, as opposed to, let's say, that being the issue. Well, that's at least a theory. It could be that just people wanted more control, hands down, and no amount of taking that away from them would have been okay. But I think that even in the hands-off approach, they failed. Like, they didn't do it hands-off enough. I would argue they could have handled combat a bit different, where you focus on the, let's say, logistics and financing your army. The bigger economy wins. Could have been a very fun way of doing things, and it's partially in there. You need to have like the right equipment available, and recently they've patched in so that the army consumes more stuff, like canned food and other things give you certain bonuses, and that I much prefer to the older system. I think that was partially what was missing, having the economy contribute a lot more to your military successes, because Victoria is an economy-focused game. And this moves me on to something positive about Paradox games, which I think is amazing. And that's the fact that Paradox games, each and every one of them, has, let's say, a unique focus. They're different, they're not all the same. It's not like a copy-paste structure or system. There were some grand strategy games I tried out that tried to, let's say, simulate the entirety of humanity from the start to modern day, and I think they failed significantly because there wasn't anything unique for each era. They didn't differentiate themselves, they didn't focus on certain aspects of the era that, let's say, made them unique or made them stand out. This is an issue that I feel a bit with 4X games. Civilization does its best to introduce new systems through its tech tree over time gradually, but the issue I have there is that as a player, in order to win the game, you need to be way more technologically advanced than the rest, so you can end up in a situation where you're fighting archers with tanks at the end of the game, which is a bit, let's say, removes from the experience. Along with other issues, it's not as granular as grand strategy games. But when it comes to Paradox, because you're focused on a certain time period, I feel like there's a lot more involved mechanics. You have this sense of believability that other games can't really replicate, especially when you try to take the full timeline spectrum. For example, the extended timeline is a mod that I relatively enjoy within Europa Universalis 4, but I could never have myself play throughout the entire timeline, although I oftentimes complain about EU ending too early. Not that the 1820s is too early, I don't want the start date to be pushed back necessarily, I just feel like I wanted the game itself to, let's say, move faster. That's one way to explain it. I feel like World Conquest, for someone who isn't trying to abuse the AI and abuse the systems, isn't really that easy. You need more time to do that, so I just feel like things should happen a bit faster within an EU game, but that's just a personal preference. Some people might disagree. But the point that I'm saying is good within Paradox games here is the fact that they all have this involved, let's say, style, this vibe, this feeling. Crusader Kings has a focus on the dynasties, on the families. This is what matters the most. Some people could play and not really care about expanding their territory. Europa Universalis, I feel like the main enjoyable factor of the game is expanding your territory, trying to manage or control trade, colonization. These are some of the elements that I find the most enjoyable within EU. And then you can move on to Victoria, where I believe dominating the economy is the most fun aspect. And then finally within Point 4, it's just destroying your enemies with better armies. That's like the fun aspect of it. So each of them have a different focus, in my opinion, and some of them have strengths and weaknesses. And I do believe that some of the formulas do need to be updated. For example, now looking at the Europa Universalis 5, or Project Kaiser, the Tinto talks that are coming out now, I do prefer it to the way that Europa Universalis 4 is structured, and a lot of it comes from the fact that they're trying to add a lot more depth and a lot more complexity, which I think can be a hit or miss, because I think Imperator Rome took that and did it in a very shallow way, which was not fun. So the important aspect here is to focus on the fun, and I do believe that that is something that Paradox does focus on, and does really show within their work, and I do believe it's one of the things that give them an edge, not focus on fun, and having everything else be secondary. The last, but definitely not least, in fact I'd argue is the most important aspect that sets Paradox games apart, is modding. I've already talked about it just within the other points, but the mods for Paradox games make or break them, in my opinion. A lot of games I've played more because of the mods than the games themselves, specifically Hearts of Iron. Had it not been for the mods, I would have barely played the game. Whilst I understand the attraction of the military aspects and dominating your enemies, I do not like the Second World War. It's not a period of time that I really care about or find interesting, but I love the systems. The war mechanics in the game are very, very fun for me. And some games that add a little bit of economy, a little bit of management behind that military, giving it a bit more reason, as well as adding periods of time that, in my opinion, are more interesting, have added a lot to the longevity of Hearts of Iron, and I have played mods way, way more than the base game. There's no comparison, basically. And for different reasons, each mod has a certain flair, a certain thing that I enjoy about them. But for me personally, I'm not sure if everyone is like this. One of the primary aspects that attracts me to a Paradox game is being able to play as my favorite country and my personal country of Egypt. If Egypt's not in the game, that's just like a no-go for me, which is one of the issues with Hearts of Iron. I guess like the way that they represent Egypt under the British Crown, just not existing, being annexed, which is honestly not at all realistic. And I understand some of the limitations, but minimizing the number of countries in Hearts of Iron doesn't feel like a reasonable limitation. I feel like the engine can take way more countries, and they don't need flavor. A lot of countries in the game already just have like the generic focus tree, so I really don't understand why it's not just there. To be honest, even if it were, it wouldn't be fun to play with currently how the way the game is structured, because I have tried to play the game by just releasing Egypt and playing as a subject. It is horrendous, it's not playable. But this is one of the reasons I really enjoy Kaiserreich, not necessarily because of the whole Germany won World War I scenario, but because I get to play as Egypt and there's mechanics about fighting the Ottoman Empire, taking back your territory. That to me is very fun, very interesting. And this is a recurring theme. If I were to ever just like play a Paradox game for fun, I'd argue that Egypt's like the 99% of the game, of the country that I choose, because it's my personal country and I feel a lot of pride playing it. And I do feel like a lot of people gravitate towards Paradox games for this reason, recreating, let's say, countries or empires that they have a personal connection. A lot of people in the West, for example, always love to recreate the Roman Empire. That's something that a lot of people, let's say, gravitate towards or enjoy. For me, for example, it would be more so of an Egyptian or an Arabian Empire. Those, to me, I personally have a stronger connection to, and I enjoy let's say, trying to recreate these unions. And so the fact that it allows you within these games to have these experiences, to create this, let's say, personal connection to whatever it is you're creating, I think is amazing. And it's one of the very, very strong strengths of Crusader Kings, for example, because it's not just a country that you're trying to form or an empire, and there's a lot of granularity that you can create your own empire with your own custom name. There's a lot of roleplay involved in Crusader Kings. I feel like out of the games, Crusader Kings has the most potential. And I do feel like CK3 is still a bit shallow, especially compared to CK2, which was a lot deeper. But once depth is added, which Paradox does tend to do for DLCs, and DLCs are one of the tricky aspects of Paradox games, and I think it's one of the areas where a lot of people dislike their business model. But when it comes to modding, it allows us to experience way much more different aspects, different time periods, different experiences than the base game. And I think it's one of the main strengths of Paradox. So if any grand strategy game tries to, let's say, control some of the market, not having a modding scene is a death sentence. It's just unacceptable. Like when I was working on the game or trying to work on the game, having modding support from day one is just essential. It's not an optional aspect of your game. Not having it, just in my opinion, kills it. And that's one of the strengths of Paradox, that they focus on the modding support. And modding Paradox games is actually relatively enjoyable. I have done it once before. I tried it out, especially in Hearts of Iron, and it was a relatively straightforward and enjoyable modding experience, in my opinion. Now to the elephant in the room, the thing that Paradox is, let's say, getting the most flack for, and that's their DLC policy. I have an unpopular opinion, which is I do not hate it. It is a bit, let's say, excessive, especially for Europa Universalis. I feel like they've gone a bit too far. This is way too many DLCs. But at the same time, every single DLC has offered a lot of content and a lot of improvements. In fact, the base game of Europa Universalis, were you to compare it now without any DLCs to the base game when 1.0 came out, it's a completely different game. There's a lot of different mechanics, a lot of different systems, a lot of different flavor, and got added since then, just because they were focusing on the DLCs or selling these DLCs. So it does make the business model more sustainable, especially with, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the market share of grand strategy games not being that massive. I don't think the player base is absolutely huge. And I do feel like a game that's grand strategy trying to attract new players in can, let's say, make it less of a viable game for the existing hardcore audience. Creating a game which both attracts new players and keeps existing players hooked is a huge challenge, and I think that even Paradox doesn't necessarily manage to do that. They try to do things like add better tutorials or make it more accessible, but I don't think that it's worked out the best so far. I'm not sure from the statistics wise, maybe it has brought in a lot of people. But I do believe that if anyone is capable of doing it, it's Paradox, and they're investing a lot in trying to do this because they, again, dominate the market. So the only way for them to grow is to grow the market itself. And another aspect they're trying to do is to gain the most finances out of the existing market by selling more and more DLCs. And again, it comes with pros, with more content being added to the games, the longevity of the games being improved, more long-term support, because they have some of the best long-term support because of their DLC policy. I think it falls flat when the DLCs don't add enough, let's say, useful or valuable content. DLCs shouldn't just be, let's say, pushed out constantly. There should be a valid reason for each DLC to come out. It should add something of value, add something that's useful. And there's also, I think, a decent amount of backlash when things that people feel like are essential to the game or core to the game are part of a DLC, where the general people can't enjoy that system or mechanic. So it is a very difficult balancing act. Having DLC be significant, but at the same time not too significant to make people feel like they're screwing them over or screwing the experience or releasing a more shallow game. And I think the main culprit is because people feel like the 1.0 version of any Paradox game is incomplete. If people have the feeling that the game is complete, it's perfect, it's amazing, and the DLC is just adding stuff on top of it, I think they would be way more lenient with the constant DLC stream if it's adding new stuff, but the base experience is, let's say, more or less complete. The issue is that defining that sense of completeness varies from person to person. Some people might think that at a certain point the game is complete, it's perfect, it's amazing, I have no issues with it, while others might feel like it has barely any of the essential features that they need. So again, it varies a lot, and it's impossible to please everyone. And I do acknowledge the fact that DLC policy has a lot of issues, but even by analyzing what the issues are and how to improve it, I don't really have a concrete way of doing so. I do feel like you have to just play it by ear, see each DLC, what do people think. And I think that Paradox does try to do its best by being transparent, by talking with the community and actually listening to the feedback. Sometimes they do screw it up a bit because, for example, the most recent Victoria Free DLC, they did hear out a lot of people, they did remove a lot of features from the DLC and just made it part of the free patch. But this had the huge issue of the DLC being basically useless. So while listening to the community might have seemed like the smart thing to do, I do feel like by them doing that, it has hurt the DLC and thus gave them the wrong impression. So it's important that while playing it by ear, to try and focus on what the true lessons from everything you're doing is, and then taking those lessons and trying to act on them accordingly. Had I been Paradox in their shoes in this situation, I do think that I would just completely remove the DLC, just have the entire thing out for free, and then learn from that and try to create a better DLC later down the line. Maybe just go back to the drawing board and try to restructure that aspect. But I understand that not always financially that's very viable. I just think that it was a mistake, and it does show on the Steam reviews that it really does hurt them more than it has benefited them to have that DLC out there. After all this entire analysis, just my personal opinion by being a fan of the games, playing a lot of them, and I also think that being someone who wants to be a game developer who has spent time working for a company and now is trying to go solo, might have added some different aspect to this analysis. But I am very interested to see what you guys think. Have I completely missed the mark about everything? Is everything I mentioned about the strengths of Paradox not at all? Are there other strengths that I completely missed? So I'm very interested to see or read what you have to say in the comments below. And if you want to see my personal experience about trying to create a grand strategy game and how that worked out, you can watch a video for that right over here. Thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.